Hi, good morning. I'm Victoria Taylor. I'm the director of the Iraq Initiative, and I want to thank our colleagues who are joining us here in Washington and in the United States, as well as our colleagues who are joining us from Iraq and around the world. This is an interesting conversation for us today on Iraq's constitution, nearly 20 years after its ratification. And when we contemplated holding this conversation, some of us wondered whether there would be interest in talking about the Constitution nearly 20 years after its ratification. And the answer is actually a lot of people are quite interested in the Constitution, and we were overwhelmed by the response. And I think that's due to a few things. That's, I think, a testament to the commitment and interest of the broader Iraq analyst community. And I think a reflection of the continued importance of the Constitution to the Iraqi political system and its governance today. Before I introduce our moderator, Safwan Alamin, I also want to highlight our upcoming panel on the election on October 30th at 9 a.m. And we'd love to have you join us for that discussion. We'll have a number of really notable speakers, including Maysoon Al-Damluchi, Yerevan Saeed, Sajjad Jihad, Omar Nadawi, and Haider Al-Shakari moderating. So over to our moderator, Safwan Alamin, who is an international attorney at Holland & Knight and a public policy advisor who counsels corporations and governments on legislative and regulatory matters. He, of course, is also an expert on Iraqi politics and always following these events quite closely. We're happy to have him moderating today's event. Safwan? Safwan, I think you are still muted.
I'm sorry, that happens all the time. Thank you for the kind words, Victoria. And as you said, this is a very timely discussion. Not only has it been 20 years since the adoption of the current Iraqi constitution, but it's also the 100th anniversary of the first constitution of the modern Iraqi state. And it also comes at a time where Iraq faces a number of challenges and crossroads that may shape its future. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists today. Each one of them brings a rich and diverse perspective based on their own experiences and expertise. I'll introduce them in alphabetical order, first name alphabetical order. Firstly, we have Abbas Al-Ambouri. Abbas is the founder and president of the Rawaq Center for Public Policy, a think tank based in Baghdad, Iraq, and serves as a political advisor to the Council of Representatives, Foreign Relations Committee. We also have Dr. Heyman Hawrami, who is the Deputy Speaker of Kurdistan's parliament in its last iteration. They're yet to elect new leadership. He is also a senior member of the Kurdistan Democratic Party and has held many leadership roles in the party, including member of the Leadership Council and the Political Bureau. We also have Dr. Marcin Al-Shimmari, who's an assistant professor of political science at Boston College and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. She's also a faculty affiliate at the Harvard Kennedy School's Middle East Initiative. Her area of focus is the role of religious leaders in political life in Iraq. And last but not least, we have Zaid Al-Ali, who is a lawyer and a constitutional scholar. He's written extensively about constitutional matters in Iraq and across the region, and is the author of The Struggle for Iraq's Future, an excellent book. I strongly recommend it. Zaid is currently a visiting fellow at Princeton University. Before we start, I want to note that the audience can submit their questions through askac.com. We strongly encourage the audience to participate. Once we're done with the panel portion of the program, we'll move on to audience questions. I'm going to start with Zaid, and I'll start with a sort of broad question. Has the constitutional project in Iraq been a success, Zaid, in your opinion, and why?
Okay, thanks first, Safwan, for the introduction, and thanks also to the council and to Victoria for inviting me and for organizing this. So, has it been a success? I mean, it depends what your measure is. So, I mean, the Constitution sets out its own objectives, and I think there are broad objectives that we can all agree should have been part of the project after 2003. So one of those objectives, clearly, after the experience that we lived through under the Ba'ath dictatorship, should have been and remains today, I think, to prevent a return to dictatorship. And in that sense, I think that we can say that the Constitution largely has been successful. So in my view, and I know that not everyone agrees, that there was an attempt to reestablish one-person rule following the adoption of the Constitution under Nouri al-Maliki from 2006 to 2014. A lot of factors prevented that from happening, prevented him from consolidating power, but the Constitution played a role in that, and it was relatively successful in its constitutional arrangements and institutional arrangements. And more specifically, what I mean by that is the parliamentary system. So I'm a major critic of the current iteration of the parliamentary system in Iraq. I'm broadly in favor of a parliamentary system for Iraq, but this particular formulation I find very problematic. However, the overall arrangement is one of the factors that prevented a return to one-person rule, which I think is an excellent thing. And we were at a very dangerous moment in 2014, and the Constitution played an important role in preventing that. On the other hand, I can say that another one of the objectives was and remains today to reestablish a new social contract or compact in Iraq. Now, that's achieved through a variety of means. The Constitution is only one of them. And in that respect, I would say that the Constitution specifically has not been successful, and you could even argue that it's made things worse through the language that was adopted in the preamble and elsewhere in the text, and through specific arrangements or lack thereof to reestablish links between different groups of populations in the country. One example of that, and it's not the only one, is the relationship between the Kurdistan region and Baghdad, which I feel, in my view, has not been extremely successful. It hasn't been a catastrophic failure, but it hasn't been terrific. And the Constitution has not played a particularly positive role in that regard because of vague language, contradictory language, and also the language that does exist doesn't enjoy consensus of opinion between different political forces in Baghdad who read it and understand it differently. And in that respect, it hasn't been terrific. Having said that, there has been a serious attempt to reestablish a social contract through other means that have been much more successful than the Constitution, but the text itself hasn't helped in that regard, in my view. So basically, just to conclude on this point, is that it's a mixed picture. In some respects, it has been successful, even very successful, and in others, it's been a serious failure. So it's a mixed picture in that regard, in my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaid. Dr. Heyman, related to that question,
yes,
focused, from your perspective, two decades later, what is your assessment of the implementation of federalism between the central government and the Kurdistan region as envisioned in the Constitution? And if you believe that it hasn't functioned as well as it should have, as Zaid had mentioned, why? What were the main obstacles to it?
First of all, I would like to thank you so very much for inviting me for this important, timely panel, and my pleasure to be with this great co-panelist that we have. Actually speaking, and starting from that measurement that my colleague mentioned about how to measure the success of the Constitution, really the implementation of the articles of this Constitution is a good start. And also, whether that Constitution, when it was passed in 2005, President Barzani, when he came back from Baghdad, he was asked by a journalist, "Are you happy with this Constitution?" And President said that we don't have all what we wanted to have, but definitely there are important provisions and articles that make Kurdistan region to feel for the first time that we are also Iraqis, and we have a framework to protect and to safeguard our rights and duties in this new Iraq that we have. But the question after, as you mentioned, after 20 years, concerning the federalism, because we should know that Iraq is not only a country for the Arabs or for the Kurds. We have different components within this country, which is called Iraq, and federation, especially between the Kurdistan region and the Iraqi government. If you look at the provisions which specifies the framework of this federation, And unfortunately, I have to report to this panel that unfortunately it has not been a success, because out of 144 articles that we have, almost 62 articles of the current Iraqi constitution, either they have been violated or not implemented, and those articles relates to the federation, especially, for example, still we don't have the second chamber in Iraq, the federal council, because the current Iraqi parliament, let's say, it's true that we have the rule of each governor is at its members in the parliament, but what guarantees the rights of the Kurdistan region, for example? So that's why not establishing the second chamber in Iraq is one of the failures for this constitution, is one of the failure for the federal, for the Iraqi government, and for all of us, for the political process in Iraq after 20 years. Also, the blockade in front of the other governorates to establish a federal region according to the provisions within this Iraqi constitution, and the blockades in front of some of the attempts by some of the other governorates to form the other federal regions in Iraq also is one of the other failures of this constitution. We have other articles in the constitution which is very important for the federation in Iraq, especially, for example, the implementation of Article 140, which is related to Kirkuk and the other disputed territories, and the lack of implementation of this article is also one of that. And also, there are important issues like the usage of the Kurdish language as one of the formal languages in Iraq. Especially, we have even the law was passed according to Article 4 of the Iraqi constitution, but up to this moment, that law was passed in 2014, but it has not been implemented. So that's why we have articles which have been violated, articles that needed to legislate laws. The laws has not been legislated, especially, for example, going back to the centralizations in the revenue sharing in dealing with the hydrocarbon profile in Iraq as well, and the lack of having a legislation for the hydrocarbon law and all the consequences of the lack of this federation hydrocarbon formulation for the relationship between Kurdistan region and Baghdad. So all in all, we can say that the lack of implementation of these articles are the failure for the implementation of the constitution. And to answer your question on why, I think up to this moment, we are in the transitional period in Iraq. It's true that it has been 20 years, but it's a transitional period. And unfortunately, the lack of consensus-based policy in Baghdad and the re-centralization in a strong sense and not admitting to the federation system in Iraq is one of the blockade, and which has also enhanced this a strong centralization from Baghdad has been, for example, the lack of electoral justice. For example, if you look at the amendment to the Iraqi election law from the first term of the Iraqi parliament, which Iraq was one constituent, the Kurdistan region, out of 275, we had at least about 70 members in the Iraqi parliament. So the consensus was deeply needed by the other components in Iraq. But when it was amended in 2009, late 2009, and first time we had it in 2010. So right now, for example, even the turnout in the other provinces in Iraq, if it will be even less than 20%, still they have the majority, for themselves in the Iraqi parliament. And in Kurdistan region, even if you have 80%, all the Kurdistan region, all the Kurdish political parties, still we don't have more than 44 members of parliament, only from the Kurdistan region. Of course, we have some from Mosul, some from Kirkuk, from the other areas. So this lack of the judicial electoral justice also is one of the blockades for that. And also, to be honest, also the lack of trust between the components, because the Shiites, to be very frank, they have the fear of the past, of what happened to them in the past in the 100 years. So they wanted to make sure that it's not going to happen to them. The Sunnis are afraid of future, because the past they had a full control, and in the future it's not unknown for them. But the Kurds, what we have gone through, we have the fear of the past, the fear of the present, and the fear of the future. So I think these are all together are the stumbling blocks of the implementation of the constitution. Had the articles been implemented, I think Kurdistan region would have been more happier, because we are not going to ask for more than what we have in the constitution, but it's not acceptable to have less what we have in the constitution as well.
Thank you, Dr. Hyman. I mean, that's actually a really interesting point, and which we may need to go back to, as to why that's a failure of design in the constitution, that these laws were not passed immediately after, or is it political will, or both? I want to move on to Abbas. I wanted to ask, from your perspective, how do you see the constitutional framework basically influencing the evolution of political coalitions, government formation, and governance generally in Baghdad?
Well, thank you so much again for inviting me for this meeting, and also thank you for Atlantic Council and for you definitely, Safwan. Let's go back to the history. I was part of the political process and the constitutional drafting from the beginning. I was one of the people who raised the fatwa of Ayatollah Sistani when he called to write the constitution, the Iraqi constitution, by the hand of the Iraqis. So during that time, we had a dream as a new kid to write our Iraqi constitution by ourselves and without any international impacts, and specifically from the American who were invading Iraq that time. So our dream is to write the Iraqi constitution, and it has been this dream has been pushed by fatwas of the Marja'iyya and the Shias. Since that time, they follow and they respect these kind of fatwas or guidance by the Marja'iyya. And also they bring back all the fears that Hayman refers to, what's happening to them during the history, marginalism, and also all the crimes that has been done by Saddam Hussein, and specifically against the Shias, of course, and definitely all the other Iraqi components has been affected by but the Shias felt that they are more affected than the other components. But after that, I believe that the Iraqi constitution was a big step. During writing constitution during a very short time, within the American invasion, within the influence of the international community, I believe that the Iraqi constitution was a big step for Iraq that time. But definitely after a few years, criticism comes to the constitution. It's not a holy text that we should respect and we should follow every time. The main challenge of the Iraqi constitution that it is static, and it's very, very difficult to change the constitution. And there we had few attempts. We have seen few attempts from political elites, from some not even political, from thinkers, from think tankers, asking and demanding to change the constitution, at least some articles which is not affecting the heart of the constitution, but this attempt has been felt. But if we judge the constitution and the effect of the constitution regarding the political coalitions, I believe that it is not that effective. The main problem doesn't come from the constitution; it comes from the electoral system in Iraq, which has been changed a few times, but it doesn't reflect and it doesn't affect how to form national government in Iraq. The political norms that has been implemented since 2003 until now, this norms is always break the constitution and keep preserving let's say bad political norms to the Iraqi system. And Hayman already referred to 61 articles which has been violated by the Iraqi constitution. I believe that the main problem, although we have some defects in the constitution, but the main problem in terms of having a powerful and good political coalitions, is to have good national electoral system that reflects and represents the whole Iraqis. So I think that the main problem doesn't come from the constitution.
Thank you, Abbas. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and ask Dr. Marcin, from your vantage point, do you think the constitutional project has been a success from the perspective of civil liberties and basic rights, away from kind of politics and coalitions and political issues?
Thank you, Safwan, for the question, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to speak on this today. Safwan and I are one of the people who have been interested in the Constitution for a while now and have written a lot on this. But I think it's always a timely and important topic, and it's not surprising to me that people still are interested in this question, because I think it does represent for Iraqis what they described as a social contract. So the ultimate document to go back to kind of secure and articulate your rights. And particularly looking at issues of civil rights and liberties, and political rights as well. The Constitution itself does have protections for things that we do value in a post-dictatorial state. So things like freedom of speech, expression, and assembly, the freedom to form civil society organizations, to form political parties, or to join them. There's also freedoms and rights that protect people whose their privacy, so no violations of their communications or things like that. These are really essential as components of a social contract. And there's different ways to look at the success of the constitutional project in this regard. From different angles. One of them is that if we look at Iraq not as existing by itself, but compared to other countries in the region, Iraq actually has for years had more freedom of speech and expression than many of its neighbors and many other countries in the region. And I say this from the perspective of someone who travels to Iraq regularly and conducts research regularly there and asks very sensitive questions to multiple sides and groups. And I think comparatively to the past and comparatively to the region, we've had this freedom of speech and expression and assembly. However, I think it's not just important to compare to the past and to the region, but also to look about whether we're going in a positive trajectory or in a negative direction. And this is where I think I have some concerns about the process or the progress of freedom of speech. In recent years, particularly maybe in the last 5 to 7 years or so, you've seen different levels of violations against freedom of expression in Iraq, both at the level of individuals, say activists or protesters. I mean, we all saw significant violence against protesters in 2019, but beyond this very blatant violence, there's also more subtle acts of curbing expression. We've seen numerous prime ministers and presidents and other senior politicians employ laws from the Ba'ath era that are still operating to intimidate and to silence their political opponents, and maybe anyone who criticizes them in the media or in the public sphere. And this is a very alarming trend that has been on the increase in the last few years. So the trajectory doesn't look good. Another angle where this is really alarming from is I spoke of myself as a researcher coming from outside of Iraq and doing research relatively freely in the country, but I don't think that's the case for my colleagues in the country. I know that there are certain norms within the Ministry of Higher Education where there's questions that you can't ask about the country or certain research that you can't conduct on the country, including any research that looks at the developments within the country critically after 2003. I don't think, we talked a lot about the Constitution and its general success or failure. The Constitution is a little bit like currency, right? It has no value until we give it value. And I think the issue is not the failure of the Constitution. I think it's composed of a lot of excellent elements, including these protections and these freedoms. But the problem is that there is no spirit of constitutionalism. And there is a strong and concerted effort on the part of Iraqi politicians to erode a lot of the things that we think of as the tenets of this document, including things like federalism, for example, that my colleagues spoke of, or even the electoral system that Dr. Abbas pointed out, just a lot of blatant violations and neglect of it. So I think for the average Iraqi, it's really important that the Constitution remain as a sort of last bulwark in which they can articulate their rights. But it involves a joint Iraqi effort, just as it took an Iraqi effort to write it, but also to sustain it and protect it and to highlight its violations.
I think that's a critical point you raised, which is the value that the Constitution holds is it's like currency. We assign that value to it, and I want to follow up on that, and because you talked about trajectory, do you see from the perspective of the Iraqi citizen, is that value eroding or increasing?
I think for an average Iraqi citizen, they didn't have, so the faith in that value plummeted. And added to that, there's also a major disagreement about how important the Constitution is as a way to address grievances.
Thank you, Marcy. Thank you. Zaid, I want to go back to the federal issues between central government and the Kurdistan region. How do you see the Constitution influencing relations between the central federal government and the Kurdistan region?
Yeah, so that's a difficult question, and I think the answer is that it influences it, but not in the way that we would have liked. And here it goes to, I mean, there's a little bit of history that's relevant, but the present is obviously much more relevant. But I mean, the one of the issues that we have with this text and the way in which it was developed is that the consensus that was reached at the time in 2005 was between a small number of political actors who today are no longer representative or even close to being representative. So they're still very representative in Kurdistan. So, and Dr. Heyman mentioned that the KRG and the leadership was had some positive things to say about it, and that's obviously the most relevant and powerful political actor in the Kurdistan region. But in the rest of the country, things have changed a lot, right? And even at the time when the Constitution was entered into, back in 2005, it's not clear that the other actors that signed off on the text of the Constitution actually represented anything significant, even at the time. And so the difficulty that we have, therefore, is that the text represents a consensus between one series of actors who were representative and another series of actors who, in my view, were not at all representative and didn't at the time, or certainly not today, have any political clout at all. And instead, what's happened in the rest of the country is that the conversation has really moved on and has formed a consensus or something near a consensus that what's currently in the text of the Constitution does not represent at all what it is that they see as being an acceptable federal arrangement. And so in that sense, the text of the Constitution, what we still have, and in that sense, you know, it fills me with a lot of sadness, is that what we have on the one hand is people who say, well, there's a text, we should just implement it, right? And then on the other hand, you have a much larger group of people, a much larger group of political entities who will say, actually, no, we don't want to implement it because we don't like it, and it doesn't represent what we want, and we weren't part of the negotiations when it happened, and what's there does not represent what it is that we consider to be acceptable. So in that sense, the text it represents a stumbling block more than what you would have liked. What you would have liked is that it would form some type of consensus. People would look at it, interpret it, and implement it in various ways. And that's what brings us to where we are today, which is, as Dr. Heyman correctly notes, many, and Dr. Abbas said the same, many articles of the Constitution haven't been implemented, specifically those articles that relate to the federal system, because there is no consensus about them, sadly. Now, some people may turn around and say, well, there was a referendum, right? And in the referendum, 80% of the population, by and large, voted in favor of the text. And that's absolutely true, right? However, what we know from Iraqi experience and international comparative experience, and Iraq is not an exception in that regard, is that people who vote in referenda obviously have very little idea of what's in the text, right? Don't really know what's there. They don't read the text, obviously. They're basically, by and large, voting on feeling of general trajectory. And at the time, the trajectory was, at least in the rest of the country, in Kurdistan, obviously, it's much more complicated, and Dr. Heyman can speak more about that than I can. But in the rest of the country, the feeling at the time was, this is something we need to just move past. We need to adopt the Constitution and move to the next phase and establish a new government that will allow for a more stable form of governance, which sadly didn't take place because of the violence that followed the adoption of the Constitution. So in that sense, we're really stuck in this situation. And that's what's led to all of these problems over the past 10, 15, 20 years in relation to oil and gas, powers, allocation of responsibilities, basically none of which there's a consensus. So if it were up to me, we would have to renegotiate all of those things, not with a view to changing the text of the Constitution, because I think that's too difficult and too complicated, and the procedural formalities are too difficult to overcome, but rather to reach a consensus about how the current text should be implemented and interpreted, rather than just saying the text is there, implement it, because that simply will not work. Thank you.
I think we'll talk about amendment and reform later, but you raise an important point, which is that there is a text and there should be a level of fidelity to that text, or we're bound to it to a certain degree. But that is not unique to Iraq, right? I mean, almost every constitution has broad provisions that then are later defined either through the judiciary or through legislation, and I think that's been a problem here, right? I mean, even the mechanisms for interpreting the text have not been put in place correctly, which is the formation of a constitutional court in accordance with the Constitution itself. I'm going to ask Dr. Heyman a little bit to drill down on those institutional barriers and that have impacted kind of federal partnership between Erbil and Baghdad, and why those laws have not been passed, why those mechanisms of interpretation, why no federal Supreme Court law has been passed, why we haven't had a second chamber. I'd like to drill down further deep and understand what has been the barrier, even if we agree on what the text says. The devil is in the detail.
Yeah, actually, that's also the main issue that now, even for this election campaign, we are raising, because going back to the Constitution is the most important solution that we have. But the question is, has there been that political will in Baghdad about the implementation of the Constitution? And it's not only about the Kurdistan region's relation with Baghdad. For example, let's remind ourselves of what happened to Ayad Allawi in 2010 when he won the majority by 2 seats. But there has been a different interpretation for Article, if I'm not mistaken, 75, about which block is the largest block in the parliament, the one before the election or the one after the election. So it was interpreted in the way that the largest block, which is that they can form the cabinet, is the block which will have be formed after the election in the parliament. So that's why he was denied to form the cabinet. So the question is, actually, in Baghdad, with all respect for the political forces in Baghdad, we are reading from their interpretation that they regret by accepting the Constitution as it is right now, because they feel that they are more stronger and they have more members in the parliament because of this electoral law falls that my colleague mentioned as well. And they think that they were too weak to refuse this Constitution in 2005, and now they feel that they are too strong to accept the implementation of this text of the Constitution that we have. As I said, in the Constitution, neither the Kurds, nor the Sunnis, nor the Shiites, no one in Iraq has 100% of what we wanted to be in this Constitution, but at least it made all of us equally unhappy at that time in 2005, and we voted for it. But now what is the alternative? If we don't implement the Constitution as it is, within the series of the Iraqi governments that we made coalition in forming the government, we had a lot of political agreements. So those political agreements reference was the constitutions and the laws that we passed. But with all my respect, there has been no respect for the implementation of the agreements, and even with the current government that we have in Baghdad. So I think from our perspective is that there is a sense in Baghdad that they are too strong to accept this constitution. And when we make a lot of negotiation and talks with them, when we talk about constitution, they talk more about the laws in Iraq, because they feel that, for example, on this oil hydrocarbon issue, they always talk about the laws and the centrality of the Ministry of Oil in Baghdad and the lack of this law according to the constitution. So that's why we needed to have a consensus in the political system in Iraq, because if we talk about minority and majority, we will always be the minority in the Iraqi parliament. And by they, I mean the Shiite parties, along with some of the Sunni parties, they will be always the majority. The Sunnis will be always also the minority. So this kind of the majority minority, the source, the spirit of the constitution has been the consensus, the balance, and the partnership. Right now, we might have some participation, but not partnership. And actually, there is no balance in the Iraqi institution. For example, according to the Article 9, it's very clearly stipulated that there must be a balance in the armed forces in Iraq. According to the latest census that we had in Iraq, the Kurdistan region, the Kurds, we are at least 14% of the Iraqi society. If you ask me what is the percentage of the Kurdish proportions within the Iraqi army right now, it's less than 1%. So where is the balance in the representation? Of course, you may ask me, okay, you have the Peshmerga forces according to Article 121, Section 5. Yes, but it has been also stipulated that the Peshmerga forces are part of the Iraqi defense system. When you go to the allocation of the budget, of the support and the training and the composition, you don't have that respect for this constitutional articles that we have. So that's why going back to the partnership, the spirit of the partnership, the balance in representation, not only for us, if you look at the structure of the Iraqi Ministry of Defense, how you can find a Sunni or a Kurd within the structure. So it's also a symbolic issue, but it's very important. So that's why the lack of political will in Baghdad, that they think because they were too weak to refuse the constitution in 2005, and now they feel that they are too strong to accept the constitution as it is right now. And if they talk about the amendment of this constitution, but according to which mechanism? So there must be also according to the same mechanism that we have it within the constitution. And they know that if the 2/3 of 3 provinces refuse those amendments, it's not going to go through. So that's why there is not that much a strong will to amend this article in the constitution. But the lack of its institution, for example, the lack of the Supreme Court in Iraq, the federal court, it should have been established according to Article 92, but we don't have it. And if you look at the series of decrees by the federal court in the last 5-6 years, add to that to what happened in 2010, you see the interpretation of these articles are in favor of one component in Iraq against the political will of the other. So the lawfare or the politicization of this institution also block the implementation of the constitution. If the case continue like that, there will be further violation of the Iraqi article constitution, and that's a recipe for more instability and also from the delineation of the components in Iraq as well.
Thank you, Dr. Hayman. You touched upon kind of the idea, the principle of ethno-sectarian power division, and I want to ask Dr. Abbas, do you think that the Constitution has directly or indirectly contributed to the promotion of that principle of ethno-sectarian power division, or muhasasa as we call it in Iraq?
Well, basically, let's go back to the history, and maybe I can raise also point which has been always clarified by some members of the legislation of the constitutional drafting, and specifically Sheikh Humam Hamoudi, which I sit with him a few times, and maybe Dr. Zaid also remember when he sit in a conference and trying to clarify the history of the constitution and the constitutional drafting in Iraq during that time. Actually, there were no intention to have a muhasasa, let's say. The vision during that time is to prevent dictatorship. That already Zaid clarify how they tried that, and they succeed in the constitution. And also there is also some concern from the Kurds to avoid any kind of oppression that might happen in the future to them. And there is also few vague, not few, maybe many vague articles in the Iraqi constitution. And the members of the constitution drafting, they think that the main reason of this vague articles is to give the opportunities to the new generations to clarify in a way. And that's why they put more than 50 articles in the Iraqi constitution to be regulated, should be regulated by laws. But unfortunately, during the the parliaments, the coming parliaments of the writing the constitution, nothing has been changed. I mean, they didn't legislate these laws. And if we talk about the muhasasa system, again, I believe that the electoral system is very effective. And if we refer to the constitution, maybe only one thing that we can blame the constitution is the constitution in the article which is identifying the biggest political bloc who are responsible to form the government. This article was not clarified in the constitution, and the federal court explained it in a way which is bring more troubles to the political system. So I think the muhasasa system is not, it doesn't come from specifically from the Iraqi constitution, but it comes from the political norms, and also maybe the political will of the different politicians and political elites and the political blocs. The lack of this political will to even to clarify or to legislate laws that clarifying some articles is part of the muhasasa system in Iraq.
Thank you. I want to follow up on that response and talking about power sharing model and muhasasa. Is your opinion that this system has further entrenched elite capture rather than promoted an inclusive democracy?
Well, it's again the concern is from the different components of Iraq is that each component want to be represented in the government. So we don't have in our political system, not the constitutional system. In our political system, the majority and the minority way to govern the state of Iraq, and that's why everyone should be represented in the government. And we have this kind of term that comprehensive national unity government. So every time everyone should be representing in the government. So everyone should have its share in the government. I think, let's say if we, for an example, if we have a government which is representing the majority, the Shias, nobody will accept that. If we have government which is representing the Kurds and the Sunnis, the Shias will always will also oppose this kind of representation. They think that they will be marginalized. If we go to the speeches of the parliamentarians, for instance, and the politicians, every side, they'll always blame the muhasasa, but all of them are attached with the muhasasa system, and they think this is the only way that could preserve their interests, and also they present it as a way to represent the whole components in Iraq.
Thank you, Dr. Abbas. Marcin, I wanted to ask about the balance between kind of religious authority in Iraq and constitutional freedoms, to the extent that they may conflict. Do you see that balance evolving or fundamentally constrained by the original framing of the Constitution?
Yeah, thanks, Safwan. I'll start this answer by saying that we do need to acknowledge that the Iraqi public has moved on beyond a lot of the rhetoric that we're using today as well, by the way. I mean, this focus on Kurds, Sunni, Shia is like, it's very reminiscent of 2005. And I think in Iraq today, when you're talking with ordinary Iraqis, this language is no longer relevant. And if you're talking to any updates to the Constitution, I think it needs to reflect that this language of sectarianism has actually quite diminished in the street. And when we do have these debates about federalism, etc., they're very much elite debates that touch upon issues that don't matter as much to people anymore, who have kind of, you know, I always say that the average Iraqi is 21 years old, born after 2003. A lot of the issues that motivated the Constitution in 2005 are maybe not so relevant to them anymore. And among the issues that continue to impact them that we can see somewhat of a transformation in societies, this issue of the role of religion in the state. And among the Iraqi public, I think it's interpreted as the role of Islamist parties in the state, which are largely rejected by the average citizen. We can see this really reflected in the lack of interest in coming out to vote for Islamist parties. There's other ways to really get at this, but you can even see it from public opinion polling and other things from Iraq. But setting aside the Islamist parties for a moment, I think the bigger role of religion in the constitution and the way that it's manifested in Iraq today is this idea of what role does Islam play in legislation, and what role does Islam particularly play in issues like the personal status law, which I think is the most recent example of this contention between religion and the development of the state, one could say. So I'm sure Zaid can talk about this with more firsthand experience than I can. But as I recall, one of the major issues in crafting the Constitution was this discussion about the role of Islam and whether it was a source of legislation versus the source of legislation. And this is a major debate that I see across other countries as well, or a major lens through which we look at constitutions in other countries as well. And in the Iraqi case, we ended up with this somewhat confusing claim that no law in Iraq can violate the tenets of Islamic Sharia, but it also can't violate democracy, and no real acknowledgement that there is no one such thing as Islamic Sharia, that it really depends on the interpretation of the cleric. And this is true across the board, right? It doesn't matter which school of thought you're from. It doesn't matter which cleric you ascribe to, there is no one set Islamic law. So this fundamentally makes things quite difficult. And then secondly, of course, is this big discussion of are laws that we think of as democratic going to be compatible with laws that we think of as Islamic, and vice versa. And so this created this inherent incompatibility that we saw resurface with the issue of the personal status law discussion in Iraq that erupted last summer. And the personal status law, for people who didn't follow it as closely, it's this recurring discussion in Iraq since 2005, honestly, and it comes up every election cycle about whether or not the personal status law, which as it stood was a law from 1959, which drew on religion, but was considered one of the more civil-leaning, secular-leaning, and progressive laws in the region. And we've had it since 1959, and there were recurring attempts to change it, largely by Islamists. And they actually drew on the Constitution, which stated, I believe in Article 41, that Iraqis can rely on their religion to establish personal status laws, and that would be regulated by law, and that was a normal thing. And it specifically said religions and sects. So establishing the basis for having a family law that governs marriage, divorce, inheritance, custody, etc., that's based on religion. This only really came into play and only really passed in the last summer and like throughout the following months, when there was this big discussion about having amendments to the personal status law so that every Iraqi citizen could basically choose between the 1959 law, a Shia law, or a Sunni law. And of course, this met with huge uproar from civil society because the concern about Islamic law was its blasé attitude towards the legal age of marriage, which would be defined by the age of maturity, which might lead us to issues of child marriage. And there was a huge uproar from Iraqi civil society. There was also uproar about the age of custody for mothers, etc. The law that was ultimately passed kind of acquiesced to the civil society fear by saying that the legal age would not violate the 1959 personal status law, but only basically the Shia legislators, the Shia parliamentarians wanted a specifically Shia law. And to this day, right now, this law continues to upset a lot of Iraqis, both in civil society, myself included. But even though it upsets us, it's not an unconstitutional law completely, because it's a law that was basically promised by the Constitution. In another way, you could say it's unconstitutional because it might violate some tenets of democracy, including maybe Iraqi women's public opinion if we were ever to actually consult all Iraqi women on this. It might be an undemocratic law in ways. So it creates this vagueness that Zaid talked about repeatedly. But the danger of vagueness when it comes to religion is one of these things that can really rile people up. And religious authority in Iraq isn't really confined to political authority. There's, powerful religious institutions in Iraq. And I've written a lot about this if you're interested in the politics of religion and the personal status law. It's actually quite fascinating. Sorry to go on for so long.
No, that was perfect, Marcin. Actually, you raised an important point, which is the Constitution stipulated that there should be no law that contradicts the religious tenets. But to my knowledge, and Zaid, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think a single law has been struck down in Iraq on the basis of contradicting major religious tenets of Islam or Sharia. The source of the personal status law came from the constitutional provision. So Zaid, you had a kind of a first-hand first-person view of that process. How do you think that discussion shaped where we are right now? At the time, I think the role of religion was so central to all the constitutional conversation people were having in the drafting. But for some reason, that has not been, other than the personal status law, that hasn't been part of the constitutional conversation in Iraq.
No, it hasn't been, and it's not unique to Iraq because this is a conversation that happens everywhere, right? And all Arab Muslim countries is the role of religion in the constitution, not in society, but in religion. And it's always a conversation that's brought by Islamist or Islamically leaning parties. And the reason why they bring it in the context of the constitution is as a means to demonstrate their political power. Right? It's like, we're going to impose this on everyone, regardless of what it is that you believe or want, or what you think is decent or correct or whatever, not because it's something that we think is really going to radicalize society or change things in a way that we really want, but because it's a demonstration of our political power. We can impose things in a way that upsets the other side, right? And as you rightly point out, not just in Iraq, but in the crushing majority of countries where this has become a constitutional provision, it's then almost never applied, right? It almost never reaches the courts. It's just a provision that's there that demonstrates that at a particular time, there was a group of people who, adhere to a particular political vision, who are trying to demonstrate their political power, right? So yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that particular point.
Thanks, Zaid. I know questions are coming in, but I encourage the audience to submit the questions before we move on to the audience part on askac.com. The last part before audience questions, I want to talk about reform and moving forward. We don't have a lot of time, but I'll ask each one of you kind of your view of where we're moving and how things will look in the future. I'll start with Dr. Heyman. Do you think there is a way for constitutional reform or reinterpretation that can advance or perfect decentralization while also preserving national cohesion and elements of the state that should be federal?
Generally speaking, I think that should be starting from, as my colleagues also mentioned, from this electoral reforms, because who are going to suggest for this constitutional reinterpretation of the articles or any amendment to the articles that we need? So that's why the current electoral law is not providing a just, let's say, electoral outcomes. And also addressing the lack of good governance in Iraq. Let's put aside the issues between Erbil and Baghdad, but look at this whole situation in the other parts of Iraq, in the south, in the other provinces that we have, in the desertifications, the unemployment rate among the young people, and lack of providing of electricity, drinking water. A lot of other issues that Iraq is suffering from. So I think, yes, there are a lot of chances after these elections in Iraq, that all parties in Iraq to address this issue by enhancing the electoral system and also to start working on the implementations of the articles that are provided in the Constitution, and also to legislate those laws that is needed in order to implement the Constitution. Without implementing that, I think we are going to continue on the same saga of the lack of implementation, which is, I think, it's a recipe for more instability in Iraq.
Thank you. Dr. Abbas, from your vantage point in Baghdad, do you see any
Well,
incentives or disincentives that exist today for meaningful constitutional reform?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think that there is any political will. As I already clarified, there is no political will to change or to amend or to reform the Iraqi constitution. And even there is no even will to have, for instance, what's so-called I'lan Dasturi or Mulhaq Dasturi. There is also some demand to have Mulhaq Dasturi or I'lan Dasturi. It's like a constitutional appendix. There is no will to do that. I think the process to change and to reform the Iraqi constitution is very, very difficult. And each component and each political elites, they look to the constitution as a guarantee for their interest. And also there is a serious fear from each component to change the Iraqi constitution. Even the Sunnis who were been marginalized during the constitutional drafting, now we have seen that the Sunnis politicians are attached with the Iraqi constitution, and they never, generally, they never criticize the Iraqi constitution, and they don't think that there is a serious and need to change or to amend the Iraqi constitution. So I think this will be very, very difficult unless we have big opposition and demonstration in the street, which is happening during the Tishreen, and after Tishreen, there is a will in the presidency and also from the parliament and also from the prime minister office. There is a will to have at least to absorb the anger from the people, to show that there is an intention to change the constitution, but seriously, they were not that serious to change the constitution or to have even amendments, even to the articles, which is everyone agreed that it should be changed. For instance, I can give you even one article. There is an article talking about the number of parliamentarians in the Iraqi parliament, in the Council of Representatives, which has been violated as one of the 60 articles that Mr. Heyman refers to. But even in this articles, which is everyone that believe that this should be changed, nobody call for a committee to change these kind of articles.
And Zaid, I know you have experience with those processes that took place following the protest, with looking at amending the constitution. Yeah. From your perspective during that time, what was the main obstacle, both legal and practical?
Yeah, so that was like a really sad display. I really got to say. I mean, Abbas has already given some indication about this, but just to go a little bit further, is that after the popular uprising that took place in 2019 and 2020, very rapidly, shortly thereafter, or during the uprising, the parliament and the prime minister's office at the time and the presidents of the republic put together each their own committee, right? So there were three separate committees that were working to propose constitutional amendments and constitutional reform, and that were meeting and so on and so forth. And so I was asked to serve as an advisor to most of that. Basically, I attended a lot of the committee meetings. I attended each one of the committee meetings. I mean, not every single meeting, but I was there for a big part of it. And the conversations that were taking place in those committees were so far removed from what people were talking about in the streets. It was really, really sad, and really demonstrated immediately to me how little interest the political class really had in amending the constitution or in responding to ordinary people's needs. Or it wasn't even a matter of interest. It was also that they had no understanding of what people wanted. I remember there was one conversation that I had with an advisor to the prime minister at the time, who's no longer in office now, who said that actually, there's no reason at all to change anything in the constitution because Iraq's constitution is the best constitution in the region. And he said, as a demonstration of that, he said, we were just in Cairo and President Sisi had nothing but praise for us, he said, right? So, well, my response to that at the time was, well, people in the street in Baghdad beg to differ. And he said, yeah, well, they don't really have anything to complain about. I don't know what they're talking about, right? That's a summary, but basically that's the conversation that took place at the highest echelons of government at the time, when people just a mile away from us were being shot in the face with tear gas canisters and their skulls were being penetrated by them or whatever. It was just really a revolting and very difficult conversation to have at the time. So yeah, and I agree completely with Dr. Abbas that I don't expect there to be any meaningful move towards formal constitutional reform currently because of the lack of political will and because the amendment procedures are just so difficult. But in my view, they're wrong. I mean, that conversation should be taking place because there are a lot of problems and we're still encountering them as we go along on a day-to-day basis. I mean, specifically in relation to federalism, once again, I mean, this isn't a marginal issue. This is an issue that really is a big problem for Iraq moving forward. It's constantly a recurring problem. It eats up a lot of political debate, a lot of political time. There isn't a consensus at all between Kurdistan and Baghdad. And I agree with Dr. Heyman that sadly, there's a lot of political forces in Baghdad that take this now as a matter of we're stronger now, we're in a much better position, so therefore let's try to impose our vision. But they're totally mistaken about that, in my view. And the alternative to formal constitutional reform would be to have a meaningful conversation, a political conversation, and also a social conversation about federalism. I mean, what is it for in Iraq? I mean, what is it designed to achieve? Let's try to reach consensus about this very basic question, is what is our federal system designed to achieve? In my view, and this is not reflected at all in the Constitution, it should be a means to achieve some type of solidarity in the country between peoples, right? And in fact, what's actually been happening over the past 20 years is that political forces in Baghdad use it as a stick to try to hit Kurdistan as hard as they can whenever they want to. And the best demonstration of that is the multiple occasions on which they've cut off the flow of fiscal transfers from Baghdad to Kurdistan, which is an abominable crime. I mean, it's like an unbelievable act of self-harm on Iraqi society and on any form of trust that exists between Iraq's different components, right? So the mere fact that they even contemplate doing that, let alone actually do it, is a reflection that they don't know what it's for. They don't know what federalism is for, which is also a reflection of the fact that we need a conversation about it. So I'm very sad, and sadly I agree with Abbas when he says that there's no political will, because there definitely should be. There definitely should be a conversation that people should be having, and that should be happening at the upper echelons. And I agree with Marcin that, of course, these are elitist conversations that most people don't really care about, but federalism is, by its very nature, an elite conversation. It's not something that an average dentist can really have a lot of input on, because it's just the nature of the beast, basically, right? So anyway, I'll leave it there, and sorry if I've gone on for too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaid. Marcin, Zaid mentioned earlier one of the successes of the Constitution from his perspective is that prevented single party or single strongman ruler kind of outcome post 2003. But I don't know if you've heard the same, but when we hear protesters' demands about reform, constitutional reform, a lot of the times they include the need for a more presidential centralized system. Why is that the case?
I mean, Safwan, I won't resist the opportunity to jump on the federalism discussion because I think Zaid raised a really interesting point. I agree with you that the mechanics of federalism are things that are definitely not for dentists and not for doctors either in the Iraqi case. But I will say that federalism does touch on everyone's life, and there is a big discussion about federalism in Iraq. And the issue is, we were talking about like Baghdad and Erbil and the way that politicians sometimes take advantage of the weakness of one or the strength of the other to kind of ignore the Constitution. Well, we can't really ignore the referendum in 2017. The referendum in 2017 ingrained in every Iraqi outside of the Kurdistan region that federalism was about separatism. It wasn't about inclusion. And going back from that will require such hard work. There's a lot of research conducted about like how Iraqis perceive federalism. And because of it being a historically centralized state, it took a lot of work to make federalism even like arise as a concept in Iraq that was something about inclusion. And when Baghdad was facing weakness and Erbil decided to ignore the constitution and to have a referendum, that actually had a long-lasting impact on how citizens themselves perceive federalism. Now, federalism isn't regarded as a good thing. It's regarded as a separation of the country, a breakdown of the country into groups, taking us actually back to square one. And relatedly, square one, going back to a dictatorial regime or one-party rule, Safwan, I agree with you. I've seen this a lot in different protests. I don't think it's the overwhelming message, but I think what it reflects to me is two things. A, that there are basically three schools of thought among protesters and among Iraqi civil society about how to get change to occur. And the three schools of thought range from the reformist to the revolutionary. And the presidential system is kind of this thing in the middle where they're not willing to engage in parliamentary reforms or to run for office. But at the same time, they also don't want to burn everything down and start from scratch. So they think maybe this dramatic reform in which if we get one powerful leader, maybe they'll be more efficient than the multiple powerful politicians we have right now. And so to me, it suggests this grappling with how to get change in Iraq, but without dragging us back into war and into conflict. But it also is an expression of the dissatisfaction of the representation we have right now.
Thank you, Marcin. We're going to move on to audience questions. We have a question from Justin Alexander. What can Syria learn from Iraq's experience as it looks to draft its own permanent constitution? Marcin, I think you and Hamza wrote something about that recently. Do you want to take a stab at this question?
Yes, I'll do so briefly so I can hear from what my colleagues think. I wrote this piece with Hamza because we felt that Iraq was used as a cautionary tale for Syria, and it shouldn't be just a cautionary tale. There are positives and negatives to learn from the Iraq story. And going off what I just said, I actually the major point of this article is that the Iraqi experience with federalism is something that should be furthered and that should be perfected in the Syrian case. So specifically, we argue that federalism is really important when there's been a component of society that was marginalized historically, and that needs to be convinced to come and be part of the national fold again. It took a lot of energy to convince Kurds that were genocided by a centralized Iraqi dictatorship to come back and join a national Iraq. You have to give something as important of federalism to protect them from future violations. And so we wanted to highlight that in the Syrian case, where there are significant acts of violence against people for ethnic or religious identity, to not dismiss federalism. We also talk about, the minor aspects of federalism. I forget which of my colleagues alluded to it, but things as simple as including a language beyond Arabic as an official language of the state, kind of recognizing people's belonging and equalizing them with what is usually a dominant Arab state. Obviously, there are cautionary tales from Iraq as well. I think the one that I would highlight the most is that in our constitution, we overemphasize our stand against Baathism in a way that criminalizes people and really creates opportunities for marginalization in the future. We could have just taken a stance against dictatorship and against oppression, but we decided to be specific and put nouns on it in a way that I think hurt us in the long run because it allowed people to politicize labels in a very powerful way. Thank
you, Marcin. Dr. Heyman, I know you wanted to have an interjection.
Yeah. No, just really wanted to clarify about one of the lines that my friend Marcin mentions about the referendum in Kurdistan region in 2007. Really, the referendum was the result of the lack of implementation of the constitution. It was not an exploitation of the weakness of Baghdad or because before the referendum, we have been in different types of the talks with Baghdad, but those 62 articles that I mentioned that have been violated, it has been before referendum, not even after the referendum. So the referendum was respond to those violations of the rights of Kurdistan regions and the federalism guarantees that we had in the Iraqi constitution, and also the lack of implementation of those specific articles with regards as a social contrast between Kurdistan region and Baghdad. And also, as my friend Zaid mentions, in 2014, Iraq, when they cut the flow of the budget and the salaries for the Kurdistan regions, and the lack of support even during the fight against ISIS. So, and we have it in the preamble of the constitution that the voluntary union is the guarantor of the unity of Iraq. So that's why the implementation of the constitution as we have is on the only guarantee for the unity and for this voluntary union that we have. So I wanted just to clarify that the referendum was the result of the violations of all the constitutional articles towards Kurdistan region.
Thank you, Dr. Heyman. We have a question for Zaid. Can social cohesion in Iraq endure as an organic societal phenomena without being codified and protected by the state?
I think it can, and I think Iraqi societies are even already started moving in that direction anyway. Regardless of what the constitution says and what the state is doing and what political parties want and so on and so forth. And in that respect, I really have to say that Iraqi society has been really remarkable in that sense. They've really moved on, and at a societal level, just as a form of just as an example and as a form of illustration, is that people who live in Kurdistan, Kurds and others who live in Kurdistan, are now much more integrated into the rest of Iraq than perhaps in the entire history of the Iraqi state. And you can see it at just about every level. I mean, people from the rest of the country are now traveling massively into Kurdistan every year. They own property, they own businesses, and so on and so forth, and vice versa. There's a huge amount of exchanges that are taking place at the sports level, at the cultural level, at professional levels. It's just really remarkable the amount of exchanges that are taking place. And that's all terrific, and it's great, and it's happening, partially as a result of so like broad constitutional or institutional arrangements, but also because that's what people want. People really want for these things to happen, and they've overcome a lot of the other problems that have taken place over the past 20 years. And in that sense, it's really remarkable. And if I may, sorry, but I've got to just also interject as well. I'm abusing your generosity. But on the issue of 2017 and the referendum, so obviously I can't say as to what motivated it. I mean, that's obviously something for the people who organized that referendum. But nevertheless, it does have an impact, right? The fact that referendum did take place, and that is a problem. And in that sense, in Baghdad, I've had multiple conversations with senior officials in Baghdad about their interactions with Kurdistan, where I've been extremely critical, right? And I've said, you shouldn't be behaving this way, and the decisions you're taking are not in favor of a unitary system, federal or non-federal, doesn't matter, but it's supposed to be one country. And the responses that I got at the time, and it's difficult to argue against, is, it's all very well and good to tell us that we need to invest more in the relationship, but we don't have any guarantee that on the other side, they also want to invest. They're trying to break away. They're not trying to stay inside. So why should we invest if they may very well just take advantage of that and break away? And in that sense, I go back to my earlier point earlier, which is that we really need to have that conversation about the nature of the Iraqi state and what it means, and there need to be guarantees from both sides. And I'm much more critical about Baghdad than about Kurdistan, because Baghdad is the national capital. It's much more powerful. It's much more powerful at every single level, and so therefore has a greater responsibility. But nevertheless, it's a conversation, and concessions need to be made by both sides. And so far, that still hasn't been happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaid. I think we have time for one more question for Dr. Hyman. Given ongoing disputes over resources and revenue sharing, what solutions do you see as viable to stabilize federal relations?
Well, going back to the Constitution and to the implementation of the article, and also respecting for the agreements and the constitutional rights that we have and the framework that we have. For example, my friend Zaid mentioned about the perception in Baghdad. Well, correctly mentioned, Iraq, also Baghdad is the national capital, and they have to work on that perception, even if they have it, that the Kurdistan region might not abide by. But what is motivating the Kurdistan region? If Baghdad be as much inclusive as in the constitution we have at Kurdistan's perception will not be about that. But if you don't have respect and the implementation of the constitution, if you don't abide by the agreements, political agreements that we have, if you don't implement the law, if you don't make Kurdistan as much inclusive as it should be, so what other options are you leaving for the Kurdistan region? So really this question should be asked to the Iraqi elite and the political leaders in Baghdad. What kinds of the guarantees you want to give Kurdistan region by not focusing on the strong centralizations and not having respect for the Kurdistan region? So that's the question. To answer that question, then we don't need to anything more than what it has been stipulated in the constitution. First, for example, the second chamber as the federal the council that we mentioned, we should have it in order to guarantee that kinds of the balance in the power sharing with Baghdad. And also, for example, in Article 105, there is a constitutional article talking about having a board for guaranteeing the rights of the regions and the governorates also in all the federal institution. And also a law has been passed, legislated, law into number 26 of 2016, but it has not been implemented yet. So you have this constitutional article, the law has been legislated to it, but it has not been implemented. So a lot of other things that we have. So just sticking to the constitution, implementing it, and having a timetable and a framework. For example, when we joined the government of Prime Minister, His Excellency Prime Minister Mohammed Shia Surani, in the political program, in the agreement, we should have had the bill for the hydrocarbon law within 6 months. But where it is, it has not been even talked about within the cabinet, and it has not been sent to the parliament. So the question is, we should have to, to build on that kinds of the agreements in order to implement the constitution and to abide by that. Will there be that political will? Really, let's see after the elections what kinds of the political map we are going to have in the Iraqi parliament to respond to that.
I have one final question for Dr. Abbas. Would it be riskier to rewrite the constitution and reopen old wounds, or stick with an imperfect document drafted under occupation? Also from Justin Alexander.
Well, I think the Iraqi constitution, as I said earlier, it's a big step even in the region. And as Zaid refers to President Sisi, he agreed that the Iraqi constitution is one of the best, and he complimented the Iraqi constitution. So let's say it's a big step in the region, yes. But I think all what Iraq's need is to think seriously. I mean, the political elite should think seriously to reform and to amend some articles in the Iraqi constitution. And amending articles which everyone agreed is also a step to think to have a big reform in the Iraqi constitution. But unfortunately, at the moment, there is no serious political will to amend the constitution and to have a reform on this text.
I think a theme that I heard throughout is there is a need for a conversation, for dialogue. The question, Zaid, you mentioned this a few times. The question really, for me, would be who would sponsor that conversation? Who would sponsor? Because that matters. If Baghdad does it, then that is not going to work. If Erbil does it, that's not going to work. If it's if it's a foreign actor, that's probably not going to work. So there is as much, I think, importance in who sponsors and who sponsors that conversation as a conversation itself. I think we've reached the end of our program. This discussion, in my mind, has spawned several other equally important discussions, and we could hold events, maybe 10 events related to the subjects we've talked about. But I'd like to thank our esteemed panelists for your time and your contributions, and I'd like to thank our audience for engaging with us, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.